Welcome to episode 80 of Talking Dairy. I'm today's host, Jack McGowan. In today's podcast, we're excited to have DairyNZ senior scientist Dawn Dalley with us. Dawn will be sharing her experience on managing cows during winter and delving into research conducted over the past 15 years, which highlights what cows need to thrive in wet winter conditions. Tēnā koe, welcome to Talking Dairy, Dawn. Thank you for joining us. Now, I know you have a long history in dairy research, having first met you at a research farm in Taranaki like 20 years ago. Tell us a bit about your professional experience and what drew you to become a scientist at DairyNZ.
Thanks, Jack. So I grew up on a dairy farm in Canterbury and headed off to Lincoln University and did an Ag Sci and a PhD in animal nutrition. And it was during my PhD that I realised I really wanted to get a job in research where I could make a difference for farmers and solve some of the issues that they were facing. So after finishing my PhD, I was lucky to get a postdoc at the Dairying Research Corporation in Hamilton and spent 3 years there before heading off to Australia for 8 years, and then opportunity arose to come back into DairyNZ, so have been back with the organisation for 21 years now.
So obviously we're going to be talking about wintering today. Can you give us an overview of the key challenges that cows face during winter, particularly in wet conditions?
I guess the first challenge is when it is really wet is reduced feed utilisation. So there's more wastage of feed in those wet conditions. But farmers are able to mitigate this pretty easily by just offering more feed when it is cold and wet. For short periods of time, there can be some cold stress. That's normally when we have cold conditions that are combined with rain, and particularly if there's no shelter in the paddocks. But that's not the major issue. The major challenge that cows have in those wet conditions is having a comfortable place to lie down, and especially for animals that are wintered on forage crops where the soil conditions can get very wet and muddy.
What research on paddock-based wintering has been done in the last 10 to 15 years, and what were the key findings?
There's been quite a lot of research, particularly, as you say, in the last 10 to 15 years. The first research program that started looking at wintering was the Pastoral 21 program, and that was in the early 2000s. And the focus of that research was really around understanding the impact of crop yields, quality, allocation and utilisation on subsequent animal performance. So we learnt a lot then around the utilisation, particularly in different conditions. So that's helped form some basis of some of the recommendations then. The next major project that came along was the Southern Wintering Systems project. So that ran from 2009 to 2012. And that identified some of the key performance indicators of that paddock-based wintering in relation to profit, environmental impact and also animal behaviour. So from that research, there was a farm systems project that was run at Telford, again as part of the P21 program, that really looked at system performance but also delved some more into the environmental impacts of our different wintering systems. At the same time, the Forages for Reduced Nitrate Leaching program was looking into catch crops and fodder beet as alternative wintering options. And then probably the last area or the most recent research that's been done in this space is a farm system study at the Southern Dairy Hub, where we've been comparing wintering on kale to wintering on fodder beet, and particularly looking at the impact on cow behaviour and subsequent lactation performance. In terms of the key findings, so from the ag research work at Telford, that demonstrated that if we could protect the critical source areas, so the gullies and the swales and paddocks during that winter grazing period, we could reduce sediment and phosphorus loss from those winter paddocks by up to 80%. And that could be done with not a lot of capital investment required. It was just really came down to planning of the planting and the grazing of those paddocks.
So how do we protect the critical source areas?
When we did the research, we just fenced them off so the cows could not actually graze right through them during the winter period. Subsequently, we've identified that it's actually better not to plant those areas in crop at all, so leave them in grass because that provides a filter for any runoff that's coming off the paddock as well. And it also means that you haven't got crop that needs to be eaten off right at the end of the winter period. Yeah, so the research, I guess, gave an indication of the scale of the benefit, and then we've modified the recommendations in terms of how you set the paddock up subsequently to that research. In terms of other key findings around nitrate leaching, so AgResearch did some measurements at the Southern Dairy Hub as part of the farm systems comparison and looked at nitrate leaching from kale and fodder beet paddocks and measured a 50% reduction in nitrate leaching when cows were wintered on fodder beet compared with when they were wintered on kale. That was a bit of a surprising result because it was assumed that because the fodder beet had a higher yield, so you had a higher stocking density on it, that you would actually leach more from that crop. But because of the difference in the nitrogen content of the crop, it meant both on a per hectare basis and also on a per cow wintered basis that the leaching losses were less from the fodder beet than the kale. One of the things that did come out of that, so a real positive from the fodder beet, was the reduced nitrate leaching. The other positive from the fodder beet was it's very good at putting body condition score on cows, so getting them back to those pre-calving targets. But because of the low bulb protein content and also the low phosphorus content in the fodder beet, we needed to make sure that there was the appropriate supplementation that went alongside that crop to ensure that we had good animal health and subsequent milk production. So that was making sure that there was phosphorus supplementation and that the forage supplement that was being fed with the fodder beet had a good protein content balance to make sure we were meeting the protein requirements. The last key finding from the research was the work that we did looking at the impact of paddock conditions on animal behaviour. What that identified was that it was actually the surface water pooling that was the paddock factor that had the biggest impact on lying time.
What did we think it was previous to that research?
Prior to the study, it had been assumed that it was pugging depth that was going to impact the cow comfort the most, but that was not the case in our study. And really, when we started measuring the pugging depth, what we realised was that you could have paddocks where there was quite deep pugging, but that soil was still quite dry and crumbly. And it was really when the soil conditions became very sodden that the cows just didn't like lying down in those conditions.
So it's the presence of the water. I guess that makes it a bit colder as well.
Yes, yeah.
So a lot of the recent research has been at the Southern Dairy Hub, and farmers down that way will be very familiar with that farm, I expect. For us northerners, tell us a little bit about it.
The Southern Dairy Hub is a commercial scale research farm that is set up to do farm systems research at scale. It's a relatively new farm, so I think we're just about to enter our 7th season, so relative to some of the other research farms around the country, it's pretty new, but it has very good farmer engagement. And the first project that we did was really looking at the wintering, so how could we improve wintering practices, because that was a major challenge for the region, and also focused on achieving nutrient loss reduction targets, so looked at stocking rate and nitrogen fertiliser. So before we did the behaviour research, we were adopting good management practice as we knew it then, so the use of portable water troughs and back fences, and also part of the property is flood prone, so we were not wintering on those flood prone river flats. And then our other practice that we were doing in relation to, I guess, the cold and wet conditions was offering additional feed during those cold and wet periods.
You said that those were the good management practices that you were implementing before this research. What changes have you made on the Southern Dairy Hub as a result?
So we've added to those. So we're still doing those 4 practices that I talked about. But as a result of that research that we did, we now set all of our crop paddocks up to graze into the prevailing weather conditions. And the reason for that is the research showed that the area closer to the feed face is actually drier. So what we want to do is protect that when that rain comes through, so the cows get driven back to the back fence, and so that gets a bit wetter there. But when the weather clears, they can come back onto that better ground closer to the feed face. The other thing is that we discovered that, particularly with kale, that actually provides shelter for the animals. So we want to keep that area as dry as possible through those weather conditions. The other thing that we've implemented is we have some barley straw on hand. And so if we've had some wet conditions and it looks like it's going to be wet for another 24 hours or so, we'll actually roll those bales out on the crop paddock to give the animals an alternative surface to lie on. And the last factor that we've implemented is all of our crop paddocks are now set up with grass buffer zones. So within the paddock, there'll be a grass area, normally at the leeward side of the weather conditions. And so if it's been wet for an extended period, then we open up that grass area for the animals to be able to go and lie down out in that period, so they're not actually where the crop's been grown. So more solid soil conditions, and also with having grass on them rather than being bare soil.
Okay, so the soil conditions on the grass part are more solid because it hasn't been cultivated?
Yes, that's correct.
So Southern Dairy Hub is located in Southland, but you're familiar with farming around New Zealand, having spent periods of your career in those regions. Tell us, how's the research from the Southern Dairy Hub applicable to the rest of the country?
Yeah, so people think that it only gets wet in Southland, but as you say, I have been involved from Hamilton right down to Southland, and we do get winter rain and cold conditions in other areas, and also a lot of the other regions also have quite heavy soil types as well. So the results are definitely relevant to the rest of the country, particularly where the cows are being wintered on forage crops. Interestingly, that like the surface wetness, it has the biggest impact on lying time in what we've found from our research, but research that has been done with off-paddock infrastructure, so loafing pads, feed pads, those sorts of things, that have maybe a wood chip based, have also demonstrated that it's that wetness that has the biggest impact on the lying conditions. It was nice when our research, we found similar findings from the paddock-based. The other factor, I guess, in terms of the relevance of the Southland research to the rest of the country, is that even on lighter soils, there's normally a layer of topsoil that can become very sodden as well. And I've actually observed that at the Ashley Dean Research Farm in Canterbury, where there's actually not a lot of topsoil, but after a period of rain, that the whole surface became sodden and the cows were just not wanting to lie down on those areas as well. So definitely relevant to other areas of the country.
Yes, it sounds like any farmer can implement these good practices.
Yes, definitely. And even in grass conditions as well, because we know that that can get wet and sodden at times. So just thinking about what that means in terms of the lying times of the cows.
Okay, so these are great ideas. How will the farm team know when they should take action?
So for us, we have a written wintering plan, and we have paddock plans for each of our crop paddocks. And so there'll be a discussion about that going into winter in terms of what the management is for those different paddocks, and also ongoing conversations. So we've just at the Southern Dairy Hub had a recent example where it has been particularly wet at the start of winter. And so the farm team knowing what the triggers are for when we implement the different parts of the plan, and also knowing that it doesn't have to be every paddock that it is implemented on. So we've just had the situation where 2 of our crop paddocks, we had to implement our pasture breakout zone because those paddocks were quite a lot wetter than the other 2. And then for us, it's daily feedback in terms of what they're seeing in those paddocks. So we actually use WhatsApp a lot for the farm team to be able to just put in a picture or a post to say, this is what I'm seeing, what do we need to be doing?
What DairyNZ resources are available to help farm teams with this?
So there's a very good section on the DairyNZ website which has works through, I guess, all of the factors in relation to wintering, but there's also templates available that allow farmers to be able to do their own wintering plans. Those templates, there are also other templates available from Beef and Lamb in MPI. And I guess it's the really important thing in terms of the planning is around involving the whole team so that they really understand the plan and know what those triggers are for when they need to implement it. So at the Southern Dairy Hub, we actually have a one-page document that basically works through when we've had wet weather, what we do after the first 12 hours, the first 24 hours, so 48 hours and 72 hours, and so what the different steps are along the way to make sure that we're providing those better conditions for the cows.
Cows and people alike enjoy crisp winter days, but most winters we get an extended period of wet weather, which of course makes management a bit trickier. What's your advice for caring for cows when there is extended wet weather?
First thing is really having that plan and having that contingency plan in place. And that contingency plan will look different for different farms depending on the resources they've got available. For those that have got shelter or drier paddocks, it's thinking about when you use those paddocks and keeping them to be able to move animals into. Really looking at what the conditions are now, but also what they're likely to be over the next 24 to 48 hours so that you can make sure that you don't use up all of your options too quickly. So I guess just being measured in terms of how you implement your plan. But it is really around having that plan, all of the team knowing what they need to do and when they need to do it, and having that feedback loop coming back in on I was going to say on a daily basis, but when it is wet, it's like at least twice a day, you're having that check-in with the animals, looking for the signs that they've been lying down. So we talk about lying bowls in our crop paddock. So when you walk across the paddock, you can actually see the indentation where the cows have been lying down, and also just looking at how settled those animals are. So I talked at the start around the utilisation and that dropping during those cold, wet conditions, making sure that there's extra feed in the feed budget to be able to put in during those periods.
We've been talking mostly about conditions for lying, and you mentioned at the start that cold stress is not usually an issue, it's more about the lying conditions. But I was reminded last week of the 1992 snowstorms in Canterbury, which was a long time ago, and our farming practices have obviously changed a lot in that time. How do you think we're placed for those kind of massive snowstorms now?
I think with the variation that we've had in climate over the last few years, that farmers are definitely more aware that they have to be prepared for those adverse events. And yes, we talk about the snowstorm, but there's also the floods that can create challenges during that winter period as well. So it's definitely more top of mind. Maybe where we, particularly in relation to the snowstorm, is having enough spare supplement on site to be able to deal with that, because if the crop is under snow, then it's having something to be able to feed the animals with until that snow thaws. And I was actually involved. So you talked about 1992. I had moved back to Canterbury in 2006. I'd been back down here 3 days when there was the 2006 snowstorm. My husband was managing a farm that had 2,000 head of stock, and we had no power for 12 days, and they were being wintered on crops. So it was, it's having those contingencies for feed and also water. That's the other factor that really need to consider, and being able to contain the animals, keeping them safe. But again, having that plan, knowing what you're going to do and not rushing into things is the key.
Thank you, Dawn. So what improvements have you seen across the country in how cows are wintered?
It's really interesting, having presented a lot around wintering over the last 10 or 15 years. Several years ago, I put together a timeline in terms of how things had changed in relation to crop-based wintering over the last 30 years. And there has been huge change, huge improvement in the way that our animals are managed over particularly that winter period. So we have a lot more information now around our crop yields and our crop quality, which is the starting point for it. Farmers are doing those written wintering plans, and when they first came out, they tended to be done by the farm owner or the manager, but now we've seen them actually involving the whole farm team in the development of the plan, so they understand the why behind the changes that they may need to make. Definitely been a huge uptake in the use of portable water troughs and back fencing. And I guess that's a result of the research that has been done to show the impact of that constant treading in wet conditions on soil conditions and potential environmental risk. A lot more farmers now having a plan B. So whether that be keeping their sheltered paddocks, whether it be a grass paddock beside their crop paddock, whether it be the breakout zones like we've put in, or for some they may have tree blocks that they could use, so a much bigger range of contingency options. The other thing is, I guess because of the challenges that we've had around wintering, that farmers are actually having the conversations. So I know a lot of the discussion groups or catchment groups organise wintering field trips, so going and looking at a range of different wintering farms and their wintering systems, just so that people can pick up some of those new ideas and little subtle things that people are doing differently that make a really big difference to the way that they can manage their animals over that winter period.
Dawn, where can listeners find more information on wintering?
There's actually some really great information on the DairyNZ website, which also summarises the research, but also gives a lot of really handy resources in terms of planning and the planning templates there. There's the Beef and Lamb website, the Southern Dairy Hub website, and MPI also have information around wintering. And there are also 2 other Talking Dairy podcasts that have been done previously that pick up different aspects of wintering as well. So there's definitely no shortage of information and support for farmers around wintering their dairy cows.
Thank you so much for talking with us today, Dawn. It's been amazing to see the research picked up and put into practice by farmers. As you say, a huge change in the way farmers are wintering. Some really positive things have happened with farmers refining or overhauling their wintering systems so they can look after both the cows and the environment during a tricky time of year. Mā te wā, Māori ora.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Talking Dairy. Check the show notes on where to go for more information on this topic. And if you have any ideas on future episodes, please send an email to talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz.